You're standing in a crowded market square on a cold Yorkshire morning in 1828. But today, something different catches your attention. Something that makes your blood run cold and your stomach twist with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Through the crowd, you see a man leading what appears to be a woman by a rope. Not pulling her along roughly, but walking with the measured pace of someone conducting business. The rope is unwound around her wrists like a criminal. It's fashioned into a halter around her neck, just like the ones used for livestock. She walks with her head held high, but you can see the tremor in her hands, the way her jaw is set in grim determination. The man stops near the livestock pens and calls out in a voice that carries across the square, "What am I bid for this fine woman? Strong back, can cook and mend, and she's got all her teeth." The crowd begins to gather, some curious, others calculating, all of them treating this moment as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because in Victorian England, it was. This isn't some barbaric ritual from the Dark Ages. This isn't happening in some distant, uncivilized land. This is taking place in the heart of the British Empire, during the reign of Queen Victoria, in a society that prided itself on moral superiority and Christian values. What you're witnessing is perfectly legal, socially accepted, and for many desperate people, the only path to freedom they'll ever know. The practice we're about to explore wasn't born from sadism or primitive thinking. It emerged from a legal system so rigid and unforgiving that it left ordinary people with choices that seem unthinkable today. To understand why Victorian men led their wives to market squares with ropes around their necks, we need to step into a world where women weren't considered people under the law. They were property, plain and simple. In Victorian England, the moment a woman spoke her wedding vows, her legal identity vanished completely. This wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, codified law. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman ceased to exist as an individual in the eyes of the law. She became what legal scholars called a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath her husband's legal identity, like she was wearing an invisibility cloak. Picture Sarah Mitchell, a typical working-class woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, she could own property, sign contracts, even take someone to court if they wronged her. She had rights, limited though they were. But the moment she said, "I do," everything changed overnight. Her wages became her husband's property. Any money her parents left her in their will belonged to him. If she started a small business baking bread or taking in washing, every penny she earned was legally his to spend however he pleased. Even the clothes on her back, the very dress she wore, belonged to her husband. If Sarah's husband decided to beat her senseless, the law offered virtually no protection. A man had the legal right to correct his wife, just as he might discipline a child or train a dog. If he drank away their rent money or gambled their food budget at the local tavern, she had no legal recourse whatsoever. If he brought home diseases from brothels or refused to work while she labored until her fingers bled, the law considered this his prerogative as head of the household. But what happened when Sarah couldn't endure it anymore? What happened when her husband's correction left her with broken ribs and blackened eyes? What if she met someone else, perhaps a kind widower who treated her with respect, or a bachelor who offered genuine affection instead of violence? In the upper classes, there was divorce, but it might as well have been reserved for royalty. Before 1857, getting a divorce required a private act of Parliament. The cost? At least £1,000, equivalent to roughly £120,000 today. That represented more money than most working families would see in 10 lifetimes combined. Even after legal reforms made divorce slightly more accessible through the courts, it still cost around £40, more than a laborer's entire yearly wages. For the poor, there were really only a handful of ways to end a marriage. You could separate by mutual agreement, though this left both parties unable to remarry legally, condemned to live in sin if they found new partners. You could simply desert, disappear one day, and hope your spouse never tracked you down. You could try to obtain a legal separation through church courts on grounds of adultery or life-threatening cruelty, but this was expensive and still didn't allow remarriage. You could die, and given the brutal living conditions of the working class, this wasn't entirely uncommon. Or, if you were truly desperate, you could sell your wife. The practice of wife-selling emerged sometime in the late 17th century, born from desperation and reinforced by twisted logic. Since the law treated women as property, some reasoned, why couldn't that property be transferred like any other possession? A man could sell his horse, his furniture, his tools, so why not his wife? What developed was a ritual that was both utterly degrading and strangely dignified, a grotesque parody of both divorce and remarriage wrapped into one public ceremony. The process typically began with an advertisement in the local newspaper, written like livestock auctions. Thomas Brown will sell his wife Mary at Sheffield Market on Thursday next. She is healthy, industrious, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Sometimes these advertisements were brutally personal. James Wilson, being tired of his wife's constant nagging, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. She can wash, cook, and milk cows, though she talks too much for most men's liking. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a public place, usually a market square where livestock was normally sold, though sometimes a tavern or public house would serve the purpose. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, usually made of rope, though sometimes of ribbon in a pathetic attempt at dignity. This halter wasn't merely symbolic. It marked her as property to be transferred, no different from a cow or sheep being led to auction. The auctioneer, often the husband himself, would call for bids exactly as if he were selling livestock. What am I offered for this fine woman? She's 26 years old, proven fertile, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth. The crowd would press closer, examining her like potential buyers at a horse fair. They would check her hands for signs of hard work, study her face to judge her attractiveness, and sometimes even ask her to speak to evaluate her manners and temperament. But here's where our understanding of these horrific scenes becomes more complex, and perhaps more tragic. Historical records reveal that in many cases, the sale was arranged in advance. The buyer was often the woman's secret lover, and the entire auction was actually a form of consensual divorce and remarriage combined into one ceremony. The public humiliation was real and devastating, but it served a crucial purpose. It made the separation legally binding in the minds of all involved, witnessed by dozens or even hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been properly transferred from one man to another. The prices paid varied wildly, from astronomical sums of over £100, plus additional money for each child, equivalent to tens of thousands of pounds today, down to as little as a glass of ale or a few shillings. But the money was never really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by the community, creating what desperate people hoped would be legal validity where none actually existed. The halter itself carried profound symbolic weight that went far beyond mere practicality. After the sale concluded, it was ceremoniously handed to the new husband as tangible proof that the transaction was complete. This wasn't just theatrical pageantry. It represented a desperate community's attempt to create legal legitimacy in a system that offered them none. The participants needed to believe, and more importantly, convince their neighbors that what they were doing had the force of law behind it. Sometimes the ritual grew even more elaborate, with formal bills of sale drawn up using language borrowed directly from property transfers. These documents read like deeds for houses or contracts for livestock. I, William Harper, for the sum of £5 received, do hereby sell, transfer, and deliver unto Robert Mills my wife Elizabeth Harper, together with all rights, claims, and demands whatsoever during her natural life. The ceremony often concluded with all parties retiring to the nearest public house for what amounted to a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. Church bells might even ring out across the village, as if celebrating a legitimate marriage. The community, starved for entertainment and drama in their harsh daily lives, treated these occasions as public spectacles that combined elements of theater, legal proceeding, and carnival all rolled into one. But not every wife sale followed this scripted arrangement between secret lovers seeking social legitimacy. Some were genuine auctions where desperate women found themselves being examined and bid upon by complete strangers. In March 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife during what the records describe as a fit of conjugal indifference at the local alehouse. When he sobered up the next morning and begged her to return home, she refused outright. The humiliation and rejection drove him to hang himself from the rafters of his workshop. The sheer desperation that led to both the sale and its tragic aftermath reveals the impossible psychological pressures these legal restrictions created for ordinary people. Picture yourself in Mary's position. Let us call her Mary, because so many of these women, S names have been lost to history. You're standing in Manchester Market Square in 1824, a halter scratching against your neck, while strangers debate your worth like you're a broodmare. The first bidder offers 5 shillings, but when you look into his eyes, you see something that terrifies you, perhaps the same cruel glint you've learned to fear in your current husband's gaze. You shake your head firmly, exercising the one small power you have left, the right to refuse buyers you find unsuitable. The crowd murmurs approvingly. Even in this degrading spectacle, community standards still applied. A woman clearly being sold against her could generate sympathy and sometimes intervention from spectators who might otherwise enjoy the entertainment. You're put up for auction again, this time for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The second bidder seems kinder, younger, with work-calloused hands that suggest he knows honest labor. You nod your consent, and the crowd erupts in cheers. You've just purchased your freedom for the price of a decent meal, but that freedom came at the cost of your dignity and any illusion that you controlled your own destiny. The practice was particularly concentrated in Yorkshire, where harsh industrial conditions and rural poverty created perfect storms of desperation. Of the documented Victorian-era wife sales that historians have uncovered, 27 took place in Yorkshire alone. In Halifax, one blacksmith managed to sell his wife for a shilling, buy her back when he had second thoughts, then sell her again to a different man for half a crown. When his wife discovered these multiple transactions, historical records note that she responded by mauling her faithless spouse quite severely, suggesting she hadn't consented to any of these exchanges. The most elaborate sales could draw enormous crowds that transformed quiet market towns into scenes of carnival-like chaos. In December 1849, a man named Ashton discovered his wife had eloped with her lover while he lay sick in hospital. Rather than simply accepting the abandonment, he tracked them down and arranged a public sale that drew hundreds of spectators from across the county. The scene that unfolded was both pathetic and strangely empowering. The woman, described in newspaper accounts as buxom and young, was sold to her paramour for 5 shillings and 9 pence after what the reporter called spirited competition from other bidders. As she left with her chosen partner, she turned back to snap her fingers at her former husband and declare, "There, good for nothing. That's more than you would fetch." Even children weren't exempt from this grotesque commerce. Wives were sometimes sold as package deals that included their offspring, with additional fees charged for each child like options on a new carriage. In one particularly expensive transaction from 1865, a woman and her 2 young children were sold for the astronomical sum of £100 plus £25 for each child, representing several years' wages for a working man. The buyer wasn't just acquiring a wife. He was taking on an entire ready-made family with all the financial responsibilities that entailed. The authorities' response to wife selling reveals the deep confusion and moral ambiguity that surrounded the practice. Legally, these sales had absolutely no basis in law. They were essentially elaborate conspiracies to commit adultery, followed by bigamy when the new couples inevitably married. Yet many local officials seemed genuinely uncertain about their authority to intervene in what appeared to be consensual arrangements between adults. In 1819, when a magistrate in Ashbourne, Derby attempted to prevent a sale, he was pelted with refuse and physically driven away by an angry crowd. Later, he admitted his uncertainty to a colleague. "I do not believe I have the right to prevent it, as it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, which it might be dangerous to overturn through legal intervention." Some local officials went even further, actively encouraging the practice when it suited their administrative convenience. Poor law commissioners, responsible for maintaining destitute families and workhouses at public expense, sometimes actually compelled husbands to sell their wives rather than burden the parish with supporting separated families. In 1814, Henry Cook was forced by workhouse authorities to sell his wife rather than have the parish maintain her and their child separately. She was transported to Croydon Market like cargo and sold for 1 shilling, with the parish paying for both the journey and a modest wedding dinner afterward. This institutional support reveals something crucial about wife selling that modern observers often miss. This wasn't simply a barbaric custom practiced by ignorant peasants. It was a rational response to irrational laws, endorsed and sometimes mandated by the very authorities who should have been protecting vulnerable people. The practice existed because it filled a genuine social need that the legal system refused to address. The symbolic power of conducting these sales in marketplaces cannot be understated. Markets were where livestock changed hands, where property was bought and sold, where communities gathered to witness the most important commercial transactions of rural life. By choosing these locations, desperate couples were inserting their personal tragedies into the most public commercial spaces available, demanding that their neighbors witness and validate what the courts refused to recognize. But the symbolism cut far deeper than location alone. The halter around a woman's neck made brutally explicit what the law only implied, that wives were chattel property, no different from the cattle and sheep sold in adjacent pens. Some sales even priced women by weight, exactly like livestock, stripping away any pretense that human dignity factored into these transactions. The practice began its slow death in the 1840s, not because society suddenly developed a conscience, but because the world was changing in ways that made wife-selling less necessary and far more dangerous for those who participated. Legal divorce, while still expensive and socially stigmatizing, was becoming slightly more accessible to working-class families. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 transferred divorce proceedings from Parliament to the courts, reducing costs from the astronomical to the merely prohibitive. More importantly, the rising industrial economy was creating new opportunities for women to escape terrible marriages through means other than public humiliation. Factory work, however brutal and poorly paid, gave some women a degree of economic independence their mothers could never have imagined. A woman who could earn her own wages, even meager ones, wasn't quite as trapped as one who depended entirely on male support for survival. The growing middle class, increasingly uncomfortable with what they saw as working-class barbarism, began pushing for prosecutions with renewed vigor. Newspaper coverage shifted dramatically, describing wife sales as disgusting exhibitions and brutal spectacles that shamed the British Empire in the eyes of civilized nations. What had once been reported as curious local customs were now portrayed as evidence of moral decay that needed immediate correction. Religious revival movements added their voices to the chorus of condemnation. Methodist and Baptist preachers regularly denounced the practice from their pulpits, though their success in changing actual behavior was limited. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, made the suppression of wife selling one of their moral crusades. Ironically, in 1889, a member of the Salvation Army himself sold his wife for a shilling in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, proving that even reformers couldn't entirely escape the practical constraints that made desperate measures seem reasonable. By the 1860s, most wife sales were conducted privately rather than as public spectacles. Couples still desperate enough to pursue this route tried to maintain the legal fiction while avoiding the social shame that now accompanied public auctions. Bills of sale were drawn up in private homes, witnessed by a few trusted neighbors rather than cheering crowds. The community celebration that once followed these transactions disappeared, replaced by secrecy and embarrassment. The courts began imposing harsher sentences on those caught participating in wife sales. Men convicted of selling their wives could face 6 months in prison, while buyers could be charged with conspiracy to commit adultery. However, proving that an actual sale had occurred remained difficult. Participants had strong incentives to claim their ceremonies were merely jokes or theatrical performances, and juries drawn from working-class communities often proved reluctant to convict people for what they understood as desperate attempts to solve impossible problems. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman giving evidence in a police court claimed she had been sold to one of her husband's workmates for a shilling. By then, the practice was a relic kept alive more by habit and desperation than any belief in its legitimacy. The world had moved on, leaving behind the legal and economic conditions that had once made such grotesque solutions seem rational. But what did the end of wife selling actually mean for the women who had once seen it as their only escape route? Legal divorce remained expensive and difficult well into the 20th century. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923 finally allowed women to divorce their husbands on the same grounds that men had always enjoyed. But social stigma still attached to divorced women in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. The horror of wife selling wasn't really the ritual itself. It was what that ritual revealed about a society that made such desperate measures necessary. These weren't savage customs practiced by barbarians in some distant land. They were the logical responses of rational people trapped in an utterly irrational system. When the law offers no remedy for intolerable situations, people create their own remedies, however grotesque those solutions might appear to later generations. The women who stood in those market squares with halters around their necks weren't just victims of individual cruelty, though cruelty certainly played its part. They were victims of a legal system that refused to acknowledge their basic humanity, that treated them as property to be owned and disposed of at male convenience. They were trapped between the legal fiction that they did and exist as individuals and the practical reality that they still had to find ways to survive, to escape abuse, to seek happiness in whatever form it might take. Some found genuine happiness in their new arrangements, affection and respect from partners who treated them as human beings rather than possessions. Others discovered that changing owners didn't fundamentally alter their status as property. All of them paid a price in dignity and self-respect that no amount of practical benefit could fully compensate. Their stories remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that the rights and freedoms we take for granted were built on the suffering of people who had no choice but to work within systems designed to deny their humanity. They remind us that behind every historical practice, however repugnant it seems to modern eyes, are human beings trying to survive, to find love, to create meaning in circumstances that offered few good choices. The halters are gone now, melted down or rotted away centuries ago. The market squares have been converted to shopping centers and car parks. The legal systems that once treated women as property have been reformed beyond recognition. But the deeper questions raised by wife selling remain as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. What happens when legal systems fail to provide adequate remedies for desperate situations? How do we create societies where nobody has to choose between dignity and survival? How do we ensure that progress reaches everyone, not just the privileged few who can afford justice through proper legal channels? The women of Victorian England, who wore rope halters and hoped for kinder masters, deserve better than to be remembered simply as curiosities from a more barbaric age. They deserve to be remembered as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage and agency they could muster, who found ways to survive and sometimes even thrive in a world designed to crush them. Their voices echo across the centuries, reminding us that freedom isn't free, that dignity isn't guaranteed, and that the price of justice is eternal vigilance against the systems and circumstances that reduce human beings to property. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such choices never again become necessary. The market squares are silent now, but the questions they raised about human worth, legal justice, and the price of survival remain as urgent today as they were when desperate people gathered to witness the sale of wives. In that urgency lies both warning and hope. Warning that progress can be reversed, and hope that understanding the past can help us build a more just future for everyone.